Clifford McKeown walks from court in 1982. He was to become one of the most notorious figures in the loyalist paramilitary underworld. In 1996 he shot dead Michael McGoldrick. Tonight on Insight we examine how McKeown planned and carried out the murder. And we ask, is he harbouring more deadly secrets?
There's a certain looseness about him, about his whole personality, and I did get the impression that this was somebody who could be violent on occasion, who was perhaps very impulsive.
I believe he was probably a gun for hire, and whatever organisation wanted to use his skills, if you want to put it that way, hired him.
Michael John McGoldrick.
Friday, July the 5th, 1996, and a proud Michael McGoldrick collects his degree at Queen's University. Forced to give up nursing by a serious back injury, he was now well on his way to realising his goal of becoming a teacher. Looking down from the gallery were his wife Sadie and their 7-year-old daughter Emma.
I remembered even seeing him walking across the stage, and you know, he was just delighted. He was, you know, thrilled, and the joke coming home in the car was that Emma and I were upstairs in the gallery looking down, and he said to Emma, "Could you see Daddy in the crowd?" And she said, "Yes, Daddy could pick out the hole in your head," because it was kind of a balding spot that he had. And he said, "Thank you, Emma." I didn't really need to know that, you know, but she was so pleased, and it had been such a lovely day.
Going back to school had been hard for Michael, who was at times still racked by pain. With a family to support, he worked as a part-time taxi driver to supplement his meagre student income. Indeed, Michael had to get back on the road on Sunday night, but with Sadie now 6 months pregnant, the McGoldricks felt they could look ahead with hope.
In fact, he sat one of his exams with a TENS machine to try and relieve the pain. And he said, you know, there were times that he had felt like giving up, but he was glad that he hadn't. And the strange thing was, you know, he looked around and he said, he thanked me for the, you know, the support that he had had. And he said, you know, I never believed that I could be this happy.
As Michael McGoldrick headed for work, tension was rising here at Drumcree, less than 10 miles away. The then Chief Constable, Sir Hugh Ansley, had taken the decision to ban Portadown Orangemen from marching along the Gervaki Road. And as Sunday afternoon progressed, thousands of loyalists gathered here to protest at his decision. Waiting in the wings was a ruthless gang of terrorists linked to the Mid-Ulster UVF, and they were already preparing to shed blood to force the Chief Constable to back down. As the day wore on, the mood at Drumcree was turning ugly. David Trimble was in the front line, but the hard men of the UVF and their leader Billy Wright were never far away. By nightfall, violence had flared across the province, and police at Drumcree were coming under a hail of missiles.
I think it was about 10 to 11 or 11 o'clock. Michael rang to check in on me to see if I was okay, and I said yes, and I said just be careful because apparently there's roadblocks. He says, well, I've been listening to the news, but he said I'm staying around town, you know, water runs mostly around town, and things are very quiet.
Just before midnight, Michael McGoldrick's taxi firm received a call to pick up a fare from the Centrepoint complex in Lurgan. A Catholic name was given, and the destination was Achagallan, a predominantly Catholic village outside the town. Even in such a troubled climate, Michael would have had no reason to sense danger.
He said he didn't know whether he was going to be late, and basically we said good night, and I mean, he always finished the conversation saying I love you, and I said I love you too.
A few miles outside the town at the Derryhirk Inn, Michael and his passenger spotted another youth at the side of the road, and his first fare asked him to pick him up. With the two young men inside, Michael was asked to turn down a tiny country lane. He wouldn't have seen a second car pull out and follow him, lights off. A short distance further on, one of the men asked to be let out to relieve himself. When the taxi stopped, a gunman travelling in the car behind raced forward and shot Michael 5 times in the head from point-blank range.
I wakened about 1:20 and I thought, gosh, there's no sign of Michael yet. And I thought, well, you know, maybe he's got to run a long run, so he's a bit late. So, you know, I didn't go back to sleep again because I sort of waited, because that would have been his normal time to be in. And about 10 to 2, I rang his mobile. And the message I got was, the Vodafone you have called has not responded. And basically I just sat with the phone on redial, constantly dialing and hanging up and dialing and hanging up. About 6:15, I was frantic, and I knew that the daytime drivers were often in minicabs at that time. And I rang, and there was no answer, and I think I got somebody about 5 to 6. And I had said, look, I don't want to bother you, but Michael hasn't come home. Could you tell me when his last run was? And I remember the feeling, because I was sitting on the side of the bed and I could hear the driver going back through the pages, and I could hear him turning several pages, and I knew the more pages he turned, the earlier it was. And he said to me, Sadie, Michael's last run was 11:45.
As Sadie's concern mounted, a motorist on an early morning drive had made the gruesome discovery that would realise her worst fears.
The police had received a phone call from a member of the public who had saw a vehicle sitting in an unusual position on the Montagues Road with what looked like a driver slumped over the steering wheel. He was very apprehensive and rang his local police station. Police went to what then became the murder scene and found Mr. McGoldrick had been brutally shot a number of times to the back of the head.
I remember Emma sitting on my knee in the middle of it all and saying, Mummy, things will be all right, you know, Daddy will be home soon, and me crying and saying, no, darling, your daddy's not coming home, I just know it. And then I said, I can't wait any longer. And I rang the police myself. My aunt was sitting beside me, and I passed her the phone, and the policeman says to her, yes, it's Michael. And then, that stage just, you know, everything just came apart, just absolutely fell apart. It was indescribable.
Sadie and Emma were joined by hundreds of mourners as they said their final farewells to Michael. Many had to negotiate loyalist roadblocks to get there. Almost simultaneously, the RUC was clearing the Gervaki Road in Portadown to force down the Orange March. Many believed that the fear of more sectarian killings brought about the climb down. In an impromptu interview after the funeral, Michael's father made his own moving plea for peace.
To those that done this, my family forgive you. I pray for you. Believe me, we forgive you.
Police inquiries into the killing quickly threw up a familiar name. Clifford George McKeown was a notorious loyalist who'd committed his first arms offence as a teenager, and by the age of 23 had turned supergrass against more than 20 UVF suspects. Among those he fingered was the then unknown Billy Wright, who he claimed had murdered a Catholic in Lurgan in 1981. It was claimed at the time that McKeown had been with him and had struck a deal to escape charges. During another court appearance, McKeown was also accused by his own brother Trevor of murdering schoolgirl Jennifer Cardy, although the claim was quickly dismissed. Under fierce pressure, McKeown retracted his evidence, but many loyalists he named were still convicted.
His evidence basically closed down the UVF in Mid-Ulster, and I remember the court. I remember the court proceedings at the time. Every day was very emotional, and I mean, people involved were. There was an awful lot of pleading and shouting, and relatives from in the gallery kept pleading with him. His mother turned up and you know, kept shouting to him, "Son, son, what are you doing?" and all this. And McKeown, who is he's a person of low intelligence, eventually succumbed, and the pressure worked on him, and there seemed to be some sort of deal, because he retracted, and then the 29 people were released including his friend Billy Wright, and that he seemed to disappear off the scene. There didn't appear to be any retribution, and I think that was part of that was part of the deal, if there was a deal done, that if he retracted he wouldn't be killed.
From that point, loyalists regarded McKeown with suspicion, although he was left to his own criminality, which saw him jailed for armed robbery. Detectives suspected that loyalists were prepared to use McKeown when it suited them. For his part, he was keen to win back the approval of his one-time comrades.
He was just a loner and mainly a petty criminal, small-time robber, that sort of thing, who was inclined to violence. But it was only when he regained status in a terrorist organisation that he then became a considerable threat. Now, as I say, there were considerable suspicions remaining about McKeown. The UVF just regarded him as a tout and someone to be trusted at no stage.
When questioned about the McGoldrick murder, McKeown denied all involvement and was released without charge. During one session, however, he did admit several armed robberies in his conversations with detectives and was charged. The next year, McKeown's brother Trevor shot dead Catholic teenager Bernadette Martin. Tests showed that the same Spanish Star pistol had been used to murder Michael McGoldrick. By 1999, Clifford McKeown was in Maghaberry prison, and the police investigation appeared to have reached an all too familiar but frustrating deadlock. Detectives thought they knew who had killed Michael McGoldrick from scraps of information they had received and intelligence reports, but they simply didn't have the hard evidence to press charges. But Clifford McKeown was going to receive a prison visit from an English freelance journalist called Nick Martin Clark. Martin Clark told McKeown he wanted to talk about his health. Secretly, he wanted to hear about collusion between loyalist paramilitaries and the security forces. But what he did hear was to blow the McGoldrick case wide open.
Well, I'd heard from within the journalistic fraternity and also from a very good source with access to a lot of information on Northern Ireland that he was a talker, and that it might well be worth interviewing him, particularly as at that point it was thought that he might be about to die. He was seriously ill, he'd been into hospital, and the thinking was that maybe he was on his last legs.
Martin Clark used a letter of introduction from Labour MP Jeremy Corbyn to gain privileged access to the prison. It later emerged that Mr Corbyn had never even heard of him, but McKeown never questioned his credentials. In fact, he quickly opened up. On the second visit, he asked Martin Clark to check the importance of the date, the 7th of July.
He said, the 7th of July is in fact Billy Wright's birthday, and the Michael McGoldrick killing was a birthday present for him. And that was quite a sensational thing to hear. And so I was very interested, and the conversation was clearly hotting up, so I sort of pursued him a little bit on this topic, and I started asking him who had killed Michael McGoldrick. And I said, was it Swinger Fulton? And he said, no, it wasn't Fulton. And then he looked at me and he said, do you want to know who killed Michael McGoldrick? I said, yeah, okay. And he said, okay, he asked me to repeat my undertaking not to tell anybody what he was going to tell me, so I did. And then he said, you're looking at him. And I was a bit startled initially because I'd been expecting a name. So I said, what? And he said, you're looking at him. And when he said it the second time, it sank in, and I realised what he'd said. And that was how he told me what he'd done. I think he was enjoying telling me about it. He was enjoying having a very receptive audience. I was obviously all ears. It was, I think, a bit of a thrill for him, maybe, a chance to boast, perhaps, to show what an important figure he was.
At a later meeting, McKeown elaborated on the murder plot, telling Martin Clark how Michael McGoldrick was ambushed, and even helped him to draw diagrams of the killing scene. Crucially, he revealed the precise number of shots he'd fired. Martin Clark did his own research and convinced he'd heard the truth, decided to approach Sadie McGoldrick. A meeting was organised.
He had said about the number of shots that had been fired, and I knew that had never been made public knowledge. It had never been released into the public domain, in a sense. And I think he could tell by the look on my face at that point, you know, that I was shocked that he knew.
Meeting Sadie McGoldrick made a huge difference to me because she talked to me in some detail, some depth about Michael, and that put flesh on his bones, as it were. That made him a real living person to me in a way that reading about him couldn't. And it makes all the difference in the world to know that if you're going to go through the difficulties of a very tough trial, there is somebody at the end of the day who appreciates the outcome.
Having decided to break his word to McKeown and go public, Martin Clark set about writing the story of the confession, and it was published in the Sunday Times in December 1999. Detectives travelled to London to meet him.
From speaking to them, I was quite confident that this whole story was totally credible and was the truth. They had withheld specific details from the article in relation to ballistics and also in relation to significant telephone calls. And to be fair, those were details which I wasn't even sure of in my own mind whenever I spoke with them.
With Nick Martin Clark in hiding on a witness protection scheme, McKeown was charged with murder and in January went on trial at Belfast Crown Court. Everyone knew the case would stand or fall on the evidence of Martin Clark, who faced 25 hours of grilling by defence lawyers. Last week the judge found McKeown guilty. It was a day of mixed emotions for Sadie McGoldrick.
I would just like to say, you know, I'm pleased with the verdict today. As you all know, I mean, nothing's going to bring Michael back, and you know, nothing replaces, you know, what we've lost.
As the judgment was handed down, one onlooker watched proceedings with a special interest. Paul McElwain's 18-year-old son David was murdered near Tandragee in February 3 years ago. He and another man, Andrew Robb, were abducted and killed during a night out. It was speculated the murders were part of the UVF-LVF feud.
I could understand, you know, if my son was, you know, if he was a paramilitary or a killer, or, you know, he had a reputation for something or whatever, you know, I could understand, you know, retaliation and things like that there, you know, but he was a graphic design student. He liked a few drinks, never in trouble in his life, not a blemish, you know. As I say, graphic design student, good career ahead of him, good career prospects, and just taken from him. And, you know, we loved him so much, and he's gone, and we're not getting him back.
The family's grief was compounded as the full horrific details began to emerge of how David had died.
His hands were sliced badly. He had 9 chest wounds with a large knife, 4 of which were in the heart. And they cut his throat multiple times till he was sort of beyond recognition. My brother-in-law had took, from what I gather, it was 15-20 minutes before he could actually identify him. And there's other injuries, you know, and there's stuff that I don't know of myself, but, you know, it was pretty brutal. The hand wounds are what the police term as common defence wounds, where he had ran and got away and he put his hands up to stop them, you know, and they just cut him to bits.
But Paul's presence at the court was about more than just lending moral support to Sadie McGoldrick. Clifford McKeown was questioned about the murder of his son and Andrew Robb. He was released without charge, but remains a suspect.
I went because Sadie McGoldrick is a friend of mine, and I knew her husband, knew Michael. But secondly, really, I wanted to see what this guy looked like, because we believe that he is responsible for our son's killing as well. And I wanted to see what this type of person looks like. And be quite honest, like, he's just it was very surprising, you know, because to see him, I would have imagined a hardened, sort of typical, you know, hood type person, you know, and it just didn't look that way. He just looked like an old man, you know, and pathetic, to be honest.
McKeown's conviction came at a time when Paul's hopes of justice appeared to be fading fast. Early on, police seemed to be making progress in the case. A Tandragee man was charged in connection with the murder, but the charges were reduced, then dropped altogether. Paul McElwain feels bitter and betrayed by the system.
Every door we go to is closed. Every avenue we try to go to, someone's trying to block us. We're trying to get an inquest at the moment, and every time we have to go to court to say that we can have an inquest, and every time we go, the police are there blocking it. They don't. If we're given an inquest, then we're allowed access to witness statements and documents, and they don't want us to have access to them. And points like that just don't put our faith in the higher authorities. I have no problem with the police on the ground. You know, I think they do a good job, but the higher authorities, I just wouldn't trust them as far as I could throw them, to be honest.
In a statement to Insight, the PSNI has revealed that more than 20 people have been arrested as part of their inquiries, which they say are very much active. They say they need evidence to bring prosecutions and urge witnesses to come forward. Paul has begun his own search for answers, however, and he's received support from some unexpected quarters.
There are questions, and there needs to be questions answered as to why the police led the family to believe that there'd be prosecutions, that they provided key incidents of evidence to the family, which I've outlined to you, and yet there's a failure to prosecute. We've looked at prosecutions throughout the 30 years of death here, and many people have been convicted on less evidence.
Lawyers for the McElwain family are now looking to the courts to help unlock the mystery surrounding David's death. Paul has received and accepted assurances from the UVF that they didn't sanction his son's murder. The horrific scene haunts his every waking moment.
My nightmares are during the day. Haven't dreamt of David or had a nightmare during my sleep, but it's just constantly during the day. It's just, I could be driving, walking, talking, laughing, and it's just constantly in my head. I would see him running or putting his hands up, or, you know, it's just, it's an ongoing nightmare. It just doesn't seem to be any stop to it, you know.
Sadie McGoldrick feels she must keep going, if only for the sake of Emma, who's now 14, and 6-year-old Andrew.
There comes a point where you realise that this is your life and that you've got to make the best of it. And in a sense, I know that I wouldn't be doing Michael's memory any favours by not moving forward and not making a good life for the children.
Meanwhile, Clifford McKeown is facing a life sentence, with a judge due to set a minimum term next month. He's already serving 12 years, imposed for arms offences the day before the McGoldrick murder trial began. The sense of relief is felt by the nationalist community he terrorised, the police who pursued him for so long, and many of the loyalists he once regarded as brothers in arms.
He wasn't threatening in the context of a prison interview, but I would have been wary of meeting him on the outside. I think he was a man used to killing, and it wouldn't have cost him a second thought to dispatch somebody if he felt it was what he needed to do.
Clifford McKeown has been notorious in this area for a long number of years, and the community did fear him. I think the community will welcome the fact that he has been convicted of this horrendous murder, and that he is now serving his time in prison, which is the place for him.
Many people familiar with McKeown believe that if he chooses, the talker may yet offer up more secrets.
I do not think this is the end of the Clifford McKeown story. It's perhaps the beginning. Only time will tell.